June 4th, 1942. Vice Admiral Tuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the carrier Akagi, watching his aircraft return from their strike on Midway Island. Behind him, the organized chaos of a carrier flight deck in combat operations, handlers positioning aircraft, ordnance crews wheeling bombs and torpedoes, pilots climbing from cockpits. Before we dive deeper, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of tea or just some water, and sit back as we begin this journey together. The morning sun glinted off the Pacific, and 4 massive carriers steamed in formation, their decks crowded with planes. Everything, by every measure, Nagumo understood, was going according to plan. Then a radio man handed him a message slip. 7:28 inches the morning. The words were simple, typed in neat characters. 10 ships apparently enemy-sighted, bearing 10 degrees distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. Nagumo read it twice. His face, according to officers who stood nearby, went completely still, not shocked, not panicked, just motionless, as if his mind had suddenly stopped processing the world around him and turned entirely inward. For 6 months since Pearl Harbor, the Kido Bai, this strike force of 4 fleet carriers, had ranged across the Pacific like an unstoppable storm. They had hit Pearl Harbor, Darwin, Ceylon, Colombo. They had sunk 2 British capital ships. They had faced no serious opposition, and now here at what was supposed to be a routine operation to capture a small atoll. There were American ships where no American ships were supposed to be. 10 ships, Nagumo said quietly. To no one in particular. His staff officers leaned closer. The Admiral looked up from the message. Where are their carriers? No one answered because no one knew. The scout plane that sent the report, a float plane from the cruiser Tone, launched late due to catapult problems, hadn't specified what type of ships, cruisers, destroyers, or something worse. Nagumo turned to his operations officer. Send. Ascertain ship types and maintain contact. On the flight deck below, Lieutenant Joy Tomonaga had just climbed from his aircraft. His plane had led the strike on Midway 108 aircraft that had bombed the American installations there for half an hour. Now he stood on the deck, still wearing his flight suit, and delivered his report to the air operations staff. Second strike necessary. Enemy installations still operational. This created an immediate problem. When Tomaga's strike launched before dawn, Nagumo had held back a second wave of aircraft. 93 planes armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against ships. This was standard doctrine. You kept a reserve in case enemy carriers appeared, but no enemy carriers had appeared. The morning had been filled instead with ineffective attacks from Midway-based aircraft, land bombers that missed wildly, torpedo planes that came in slow and were shot down. Nothing that suggested a carrier was anywhere nearby. So Nagumo had made a decision. Rearm the reserve aircraft with land bombs for a second strike on Midway. That order had gone out at 7:15, 13 minutes ago. On the hangar decks of all 4 carriers, ordnance crews were already at work removing torpedoes, wheeling them to storage, bringing up land bombs. It was complex, time-consuming work, and now there was a message saying enemy ships were out there somewhere 240 miles away. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant air operations officer who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, lay in his cabin, burning with fever. He had been sick for days, but had refused to be left behind. Now, as staff officers brought him the news, he pushed himself up on his elbows. What types? He asked immediately. Unkunkaun, an officer replied. The scout is maintaining contact. We're waiting for clarification. Genda's face, already flushed with fever, tightened. If there are carriers, he said, his voice, we must launch immediately, even if we only have the aircraft currently ready. But Nagumo didn't launch. He waited. 15 minutes passed. 20. The Akagi's deck was full of aircraft returning from the Midway strike, landing one after another, handlers rushing to move them below or push them to the side to clear space for the next arrival. You couldn't launch a strike with a deck full of landing aircraft. You had to recover them first. And besides, the scouts still hadn't reported what types of ships. At 7:45, a second message arrived. Enemy is composed of 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Relief, visible and immediate, passed across Nagumo's face. Cruisers and destroyers, not carriers. The Americans had sent a surface force, probably to intercept the invasion convoy heading for Midway. That was manageable. That was, in fact, exactly the kind of target his torpedo-armed aircraft were designed to destroy. Except his aircraft were no longer armed with torpedoes. They were being rearmed with land bombs. Nagumo turned to his staff. "Rearm with torpedoes," he ordered. "Prepare to attack the enemy surface force after we recover the Midway strike group." So the ordnance crews who had spent the last half hour removing torpedoes and loading land bombs now reversed course. Remove the land bombs, bring back the torpedoes. It was just after 8. The Midway strike aircraft were still landing. The reserve aircraft, twice rearmed now, sat in the hangars while crews worked frantically. Torpedoes and bombs lay scattered across the hangar decks, stacked against bulkheads, placed wherever there was room because there was no time to return them properly to the magazines deep in the ship. Then, at 89, a third message from the scout plane. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Appears to be, not is definitely, but appears to be. Nagumo stared at the message. Around him, his staff officers went very quiet. Captain Tairo Aoki, the Akagi's commanding officer, stepped closer. "Admiral," he said carefully, "if there is a carrier, we should launch immediately." "With what?" Nagumo's voice was sharp. "Half our aircraft are returning from Midway and need to land. The other half are being rearmed. The decks are full. We launch a partial strike with whatever is ready, or we wait 1 hour, recover everyone, complete the rearming, and launch a full strike." This was the critical decision, the moment that would define everything that followed. Rear Admiral Tam Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division from the carrier Hiru, saw the same situation and reached a different conclusion. He sent a message by signal lamp to Nagamo's flagship. "Consider it advisable to launch attack force immediately." Yamaguchi was aggressive, known for it, respected for it. He had argued before the battle that Japan should strike with 6 carriers, not 4, should bring overwhelming force. Now, he was arguing for immediate action, even if it meant a partial strike. Launch whatever you have ready, get aircraft into the air, hit them before they hit you. But Nagumo was not aggressive. He was cautious, methodical, a man who had risen through the ranks by not making mistakes. He looked at Yamaguchi's message and made his choice. Wait, recover all aircraft, complete the rearming, launch a full coordinated strike. It was the doctrinally correct decision. It was what the manual said to do. It was what his training and experience told him was right. So, they waited. The Midway strike aircraft landed, one after another. Tomaga's plane touched down last at 8:30, trailing fuel from a ruptured tank. Handlers pushed aircraft into position. Refueling crews ran hoses. Ordnance crews continued rearming in the hangars below. The 4 carriers steamed through calm seas, their decks crowded with planes, their hangars full of ordnance, their crews working at maximum speed to prepare for a strike they now knew was coming against an American carrier force that was somewhere out there doing exactly the same thing. At 9:18, the first American aircraft arrived. Not dive bombers or level bombers, but torpedo planes. 15 Douglas Devastators from the carrier Hornet, flying low and slow, approaching from the east. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol Zeros circling overhead dove on them immediately. What followed was a slaughter. The Devastators, obsolete and slow, tried to bore in through walls of anti-aircraft fire and swarms of Zeros. They dropped their torpedoes from too far out. Every torpedo missed. 11 of the 15 aircraft were shot down. The survivors limped away on Akagi's bridge. Nagumo watched the attack with grim satisfaction. "American torpedo planes," he said to his staff, "poorly coordinated, ineffective." It was true. The attack had been brave but futile. Not one torpedo hit, not one Japanese ship damaged. If this was what the Americans had, then Japan's advantage in training and equipment remained overwhelming. But the torpedo planes kept coming. At 9:25, 14 more Devastators appeared, these from Enterprise. The Zeros and anti-aircraft guns tore into them. 10 were shot down. Their torpedoes missed. Then, at 9:35, 12 more from Yorktown. The pattern repeated. Brave, doomed attacks that drew the Japanese fighters down to wave height, that pulled the combat air patrol out of position, that focused every gun and every eye on the low-altitude threat coming in at masthead level, which meant no one was looking up. At 10:22, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, leading dive bombers from Enterprise, rolled his SBD Dauntless into a 70 degrees dive from 14,000 feet. Behind him, 32 more dive bombers followed, splitting into two groups. They had been searching for the Japanese carriers for over an hour, running low on fuel, about to turn back when McCluskey spotted a Japanese destroyer racing northeast and decided to follow it. The destroyer was the Arashi, hurrying to rejoin the carrier force after dropping depth charges on an American submarine. It drew McCluskey directly to the carriers. Now he dove on Akagi, and the Japanese didn't see him coming until he was already halfway down. On the bridge, a lookout suddenly screamed, "Dive bombers!" Nagumo spun around, looked up, and saw them dark shapes plummeting out of the sun, growing larger with terrifying speed. What he said in that moment, no one recorded exactly. The bridge erupted in shouted orders, hard rudder, full evasion. The Akagi began to turn, her massive hull responding slowly. Too slowly, the dive bombers came down in a steep, screaming dive, and Nagumo could only watch as they released their bombs. The first bomb missed, exploding in the water close alongside, throwing up a geyser. The second hit amidships, penetrating to the upper hangar deck. The third hit near the aft elevator. 2 bombs out of 3 dropped on Akagi. 2 bombs each weighing 1,000 pounds, each penetrating deep into the ship before exploding. On the hangar deck, where ordnance crews had been rearming aircraft for the past 2 hours, where torpedoes and bombs lay stacked against bulkheads, where fuel lines ran and aviation gas pooled, the bombs detonated among fully fueled, fully armed aircraft. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Secondary explosions ripped through the hangar. Aviation fuel ignited. Torpedoes cooked off. Within seconds, the entire hangar deck was a sea of fire. Nagumo felt the ship shudder. Smoke began pouring from the elevator openings. An officer ran onto the bridge, his face blackened. "Hangar deck is on fire. Multiple explosions. We're losing pressure on the fire mains." Before Nagumo could respond, another lookout shouted. The Admiral turned and saw 1,000 yards to starboard the carrier Kaga sister ship to Akagi, the second largest carrier in the fleet, with 4 geysers of water erupting around her. Then he saw the bombs hit. 4 direct hits in rapid succession. Kaga's flight deck erupted in flames. Her hangar deck exploded. Within a minute, she was burning as fiercely as Akagi. And then Soryu, the third carrier, smaller and faster, maneuvering desperately. 3 bombs hit her in quick succession. Her flight deck peeled back like paper. Fire gouted from her hangar. 3 carriers hit within the span of 6 minutes, all burning, all doomed. On Akagi's bridge, as smoke began to seep in, and the deck tilted slightly beneath his feet. An officer grabbed his arm. "Admiral, we must transfer your flag. The ship is lost." "Lost?" Nagumo repeated the word, as if he didn't understand it. "How can she be lost? We were just—" He stopped. Around him, officers were shouting damage reports. The fire was out of control. The engine rooms were still functioning, but the ship couldn't fight fires and couldn't launch aircraft. She was a floating torch. Captain Aoki appeared, his uniform torn, his face grim. "Admiral, I request permission to remain with the ship. You must transfer to a cruiser and continue directing the battle." "The battle," Nagumo said. He looked out at Kaga, burning at Soru, burning 3/4 of his carrier strength, gone in 6 minutes. He turned to his staff. "Where is Hiru?" "Hiu is undamaged," an officer reported. "She was separated from the main formation. The American dive bombers didn't find her. 1 carrier left, 1 out of 4. Nagumo nodded slowly. "Signal Hiru. She is to launch all available aircraft immediately and attack the American carriers." At 10:28, 6 minutes after the dive bombers struck, Nagumo and his staff climbed down from Akagi's bridge and made their way to the flight deck. The forward part of the ship was relatively clear of smoke, and a destroyer, the Naki, came alongside. Nagumo crossed over on a line, hand over hand. The commander of the Kido Bai, abandoning his flagship while she still floated, still moved through the water under her own power, but burned so fiercely that she could not be saved. From Noaki's deck, Nagumo watched his flagship burn. An officer standing nearby later recalled that the admiral said nothing. He simply stared at the Akagi, at the smoke pouring from her, at the flames visible through the hangar deck openings, and his face showed no expression at all. Not grief, not anger, not shock, just a terrible blank emptiness. 300 meters to the west, aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isuroku Yamamoto received the first reports at 11. He was in the operations room, surrounded by staff officers, when a communications officer entered and handed him a message slip. Yamamoto read it, his face impassive behind his reading glasses. He removed his glasses, folded them carefully, and set them on the table. "All carriers?" he asked quietly. 3 confirmed, heavily damaged and burning. Sir Akagi Kaga Soryu Hiru is undamaged and launching a counterattack. Yamamoto stood motionless for a long moment. His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Mate Ugaki, stood beside him, watching the admiral's face. Ugaki would later write in his diary that Yamamoto's expression in that moment was as if he had aged 10 years in 10 seconds. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had warned Japan not to fight America, but then planned the operation that started the war, now faced the consequence of his own strategy. He had gambled everything on this battle on destroying the American carriers here at Midway and removing the threat to Japan's defensive perimeter. And in the span of 6 minutes, the gamble had failed. "What is Nagumo's situation?" Yamamoto asked. "He has transferred his flag to the cruiser Nagara. He's attempting to direct operations from there." Yamamoto nodded. "Order all forces to continue the operation. We will support Nagumo with the main body. If Hiryu's strike succeeds, we may still achieve our objective." But even as he gave the order, Ugaki could see that Yamamoto didn't believe it. The admiral sat down heavily, and for the next several hours, as reports came in, he said very little. He issued orders, made decisions, maintained the appearance of command, but something had broken. Officers who served with him for years said they had never seen him like this. Not angry, not agitated, just profoundly, deeply quiet. On Hiru, the last surviving Japanese carrier, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi received news of the 3 carriers with a sharp intake of breath. He was on the bridge preparing to launch his own strike when the report came in. 3 carriers burning, an officer said. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. Yamaguchi's response was immediate and characteristic. "Launch everything," he ordered. "Every aircraft we have. Hit them with everything." At 10:54, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters launched from Hiryu. At 12:45, they found the American carrier Yorktown and hit her with 3 bombs. Yamaguchi, receiving the report, allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. "Good," he said. "Now launch the torpedo strike." At 1:30, 10 torpedo planes and 6 fighters launched from Hiru. At 243, they hit Yorktown with 2 torpedoes. The American carrier, already damaged from the bomb hits, went dead in the water. To the Japanese pilots returning to Hiru, she looked finished. Yamaguchi stood on his bridge, receiving the reports, and for a brief moment, it seemed possible that Hiru alone might turn the battle. 1 American carrier damaged, possibly sinking. If they could find and hit the other American carriers, if they could launch another strike before dark, if the Americans didn't find Hiru first. But the Americans did find Hiru. At 5, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived overhead. Yamaguchi looked up, saw them coming, and reportedly said just one word: "Shieta." Damn. 4 bombs hit Hiru in rapid succession. Her flight deck exploded. Her hangar caught fire. Within minutes, she was burning as fiercely as the other 3 carriers. Yamaguchi stood on the bridge as smoke poured in as the deck tilted as officers reported that the fires were out of control. He turned to his staff. "All personnel will abandon ship. I will remain," his staff officers protested. Captain Tomokaku, Hiru's commanding officer, said he would remain as well. "We will stay with the ship," Kaku said. Yamaguchi shook his head. "The staff will transfer and continue operations. That is an order." But he himself would not leave. He was the carrier division commander. These were his ships. 3 had burned and sunk. The 4th was burning now. He would not survive them. As the sun set on June 4th, 1942, all 4 Japanese carriers were burning or sunk. Akagi burned through the night and was scuttled by torpedo the next morning. Kaga sank in the evening. Soryu sank at 7:13 inches the evening. Hiru burned through the night and sank at 9:12 the next morning. With them went 248 aircraft, 3,057 men, and Japan's ability to project power across the Pacific. On the cruiser Nagara, Nagumo sat in a borrowed cabin, staring at nothing. Officers came and went, bringing reports, asking for orders. He responded mechanically, giving the necessary commands, but witnesses said he seemed absent, his mind somewhere else. At one point, an officer heard him say very quietly, as if to himself, "How did they know? How did they know we were coming?" It was the right question. The Americans had known because they had broken Japan's naval code. They had read the messages, known the plan, positioned their carriers northeast of Midway, and waited. Nagumo had steamed into an ambush, believing he had surprise, believing the Americans were reacting to him, when in fact they had been waiting for him all along. Every assumption he had made that American carriers were far away, that Midway was lightly defended, that Japan still held the initiative, every assumption had been wrong. On Yamato, Yamamoto received the final reports as night fell. All 4 carriers lost. The American carriers still operational. The invasion of Midway impossible without air cover. At 2:55 inches the morning on June 5th, he issued the order. Occupation of Midway is cancelled. All forces will withdraw. Ugi, standing beside him, watched the Admiral's face as he gave the order. He looked, Ugaki wrote later, like a man who had just signed his own death warrant. Yamamoto had promised the Emperor and the Naval General Staff that this operation would destroy the American carrier force and secure Japan's defensive perimeter. Instead, he had lost 4 carriers and gained nothing. The war, which Japan had been winning for 6 months, had just turned. In the weeks after Midway, as the scale of the disaster became clear, Japanese naval officers struggled to explain what had happened. How had 4 carriers been destroyed in 6 minutes? How had the Americans appeared at exactly the right place at exactly the right time? Some blamed bad luck, the late launching scout plane from Tone, the decision to rearm the aircraft, the timing of the American attacks. Some blamed Nagumo's caution, Yamaguchi's absence from the main formation, the doctrine that required recovering aircraft before launching a strike. But in private conversations, in letters and diaries, a different realization emerged. Commander Mitsuo Fushida, the air operations officer who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and who spent the Battle of Midway in a Kagi sick bay recovering from appendicitis, wrote later, "We had assumed we held the initiative. We had assumed the Americans were reacting to us. We had assumed surprise was on our side. Every assumption was wrong. They knew we were coming. They were waiting for us. We steamed into an ambush, believing we were the hunters when we were actually the prey." This was the fundamental shock, the realization that shattered Japanese confidence. For 6 months, the Kido Buai had operated with impunity. They had struck where they wanted, when they wanted, and the enemy had been powerless to stop them. That era ended at Midway. The Americans had not just won a battle, they had demonstrated that they could read Japanese intentions, predict Japanese movements, and position forces to counter them. The entire Japanese strategy, rapid expansion, defensive perimeter, force preservation, depended on maintaining the initiative. At Midway, Japan lost it and never got it back. Nagumo returned to Japan in disgrace. Though he was not formally punished, he was given shore commands, kept away from carrier operations, and eventually sent to Saipan, where he committed suicide in 1944 as American forces overran the island. Yamaguchi went down with Hiru, one of the few Japanese admirals to die in combat. Yamamoto continued as commander of the combined fleet, but was killed in April 1943 when American fighters, guided by decoded messages, intercepted and shot down his aircraft. But on the evening of June 4, 1942, as 4 carriers burned and sank into the Pacific, the Japanese admirals who witnessed the disaster struggled to articulate what they felt. It wasn't just shock at the losses, though the losses were catastrophic. It wasn't just fear of the consequences, though the consequences would reshape the war. It was something deeper, the sudden vertiginous realization that everything they believed about their position, their advantage, their inevitable victory, was wrong. Captain Aoki, who survived Akagi's sinking and was rescued from the water, was asked years later what he remembered most about that day. He thought for a long moment. "The silence," he said finally. After the bombs hit, after the explosions, there was a moment of complete silence on the bridge. We all just stood there looking at each other and no one said anything because what was there to say? We had just watched our entire strategy burn. That silence, that moment of stunned realization, was what the Japanese admirals experienced at Midway. Not a dramatic pronouncement, not a theatrical reaction, but a quiet, terrible understanding that the war they thought they were winning had just turned against them, and there was nothing they could do to turn it back.